I'm Dan Kildee. I'm the congressman from the 5th Congressional District in Michigan. I'm serving in my first term and hopefully get another term. That's the plan.
And why is it important for you to run for this seat again?
Well, in a variety of roles in this community, I've held public leadership positions. I started off on the school board in Flint, but I was in county government for some time, worked to try to rebuild our economy and at the same time rebuild old neighborhoods. I started the Genesee County Land Bank. Have been working in lots of different ways to try to create an economy that's sustainable. And so my service in Congress, while it's a different job and a different role in many ways, it's the same fight that I've been involved with for a long time, to try to create policy that creates an economy that works for everybody and especially helps rebuild communities like those in the I-75 corridor, Flint, Saginaw, Bay City, that haven't always succeeded, even when the national economy succeeds. So there are special challenges that our communities face, and I think I have a very good understanding of those challenges, and that's why I'm anxious to get back to Congress and get to work on those problems.
And how do you really address those problems at a federal level? There's so much going on in these communities. We're constantly fighting the blight. We're dealing with emergency managers from the state, where there's so many factors that go into these communities. How do you fight that from a federal level to really help Flint and Saginaw?
Well, one is to make sure that federal policy understands the unique needs of certain communities. Our older industrial communities, Flint, Saginaw, Bay City certainly fit that category, but so do others, Buffalo, New York, Dayton, Ohio. Many of those cities find that federal policy intended to help stimulate the economy or revitalize their communities is not properly aligned for them. And I'll give you an example. There was a program called the Hardest Hit Program, and it was intended to help communities come out of the mortgage crisis. But it wasn't working so well for Flint or for Saginaw, for example, because the needs in those communities wasn't so much about helping people get their mortgages refinanced, although that was important. The bigger problem was that there were thousands of abandoned properties in those communities that were dragging down the value of everybody's property. And so I was able to successfully persuade the federal government to change that program, and it led to $35 million coming to Flint and Saginaw to deal with abandoned properties, to demolish empty abandoned properties that are dragging down property values, diminishing the quality of life, making it more difficult for local governments that are already struggling. So in many ways, I see my role as advocating for bigger policy issues that the country needs to take on, but also making sure that when we have federal policy, that it works for the communities that I represent. The Hardest Hit funds that I was able to secure is a good example of that.
And it seems like that's one that you're proud of. What else do you think needs to be done, on a similar type of a scale to help these cities, since that's one that it sounds like you feel like you've accomplished that in a way.
Well, it was a big step forward. We need to do more. Certainly reinvesting in infrastructure and focusing that reinvestment in those cities like the ones that I represent that are part of our manufacturing heritage. So we know that when America invests in manufacturing and supports manufacturing, we can compete with anybody in the world. But if we're going to compete, we need to rebuild our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our ports, our rail systems, so that our manufacturers have access to 21st century infrastructure to deliver their products to customers around the country and around the world. When the Chinese are spending 10 times what we are as a percentage of GDP on infrastructure, we know it's not a competitive environment for us. So step one is to rebuild our infrastructure, but especially to focus that money on communities like Flint, like Saginaw, Bay City, that don't have local resources, that have obsolete infrastructure that hasn't been updated. If we get that done, our communities can compete and our American economy can compete with anybody on the globe.
Now, switching gears here a little bit to talk about Homeland Security. It's something that's on everyone's minds right now with a lot of things that are going on across the globe, especially with ISIS right now. What do you think? Do you think we're doing all the right things right now? Is there more that can be done? Is this just something we've got to keep watching closely because it's evolving? And what do you think needs to be done to make sure that we're protecting everyone here at home?
Well, it's obviously a threat, and ISIS represents a good example of the new threat that we face in terms of the threat to the homeland and the threat to security, both in that region and globally. Step one would be to make sure that when we fund our military activities and our military infrastructure, that we're funding those needs that we currently have, rather than continuing to fund and provide the support for fighting the Cold War. We need to focus on ISIS and other sorts of threats, non-state threats like ISIS. I do think that it's important for us, though, to engage our global partners, particularly when it comes to ISIS, to make sure that those nations in the region, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, even others like Egypt, step up and take their share of responsibility. The U.S. Cannot send troops to fight another ground war in that region. We've had over a decade of war. It's been costly in terms of American lives, costly in terms of the U.S. Treasury. It's trillions of dollars that have been spent. We can't afford to do that, and we can't afford to be the policeman for the world, but we can provide leadership. And so I think the president has been right to try to assemble leaders within that region and get the nations within that region to step up and take their responsibility. We can supply support. We're currently certainly supplying support for the air attack on ISIS. When it comes to the rest of it, we can't win this battle just with air support. We need to engage those communities, those countries in the region, and ask them to step up and do their part.
Now, despite how far we are from the border, our southern border of the United States, it seems like this issue of immigration has been a really big deal here because of what's going on in Bay City with bringing these children up here. It's been a big issue that's had a lot of people talking. What do you think the U.S. needs to do to address this? Because no matter what, everyone agrees that we've got a problem, but how do we tackle it? And everyone seems to be in different places on that. What do you think is the right thing to do at this stage, and also to prevent situations in the future?
Well, first of all, I think it's unfortunate that maybe a couple dozen children that were fleeing a dangerous situation in Central America have become the targets for this national debate on immigration reform. I think the United States was right to step up and provide some asylum to those young people who perhaps were being victimized by drug cartels or sex traffickers, and have them find a safe haven in the United States on a temporary basis. The larger question of immigration is one that there really is a lot more agreement on than one would think, even in Congress. While we have a lot of disagreements, if we had a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives next week, we could pass comprehensive immigration reform that dealt with border security, that dealt with the needs of our employers, that dealt with the needs of agriculture, for example, and manufacturing, that fixed our broken immigration system, our broken visa system, dealt with internal enforcement. All those things can be done. But what we have is a Congress, and particularly the Republican leadership in the Congress, that will not allow a bipartisan immigration bill, a comprehensive immigration bill, to come to the floor of the House. We've seen an immigration bill pass the Senate. We have H.R. 15, which I have co-sponsored, which is a comprehensive immigration reform bill based on the bipartisan bill passed in the Senate. But so far, Speaker Boehner refuses even a vote. A yes or no vote is all we're asking for. So a lot of times the sense is that there's a lot of disagreement on questions like immigration. The truth of the matter is there's a lot more agreement than the Republican leadership in the Congress allows to come to the floor of the House. And I think that's the real shame here, is that the will of the American people is not being manifested in its laws because a handful of people see their political advantage in keeping this issue unsolved. And I think that's unfair to the American people, and it's not good for our economy.
And on that issue, I mean, that's something that I think a lot of people are complaining about, is what can or can't be done in Washington because of the such solid party divide. And how do you try to combat that?
Well, I think it takes leadership. I mean, virtually every piece of legislation that I have sponsored, with few exceptions, have been bipartisan bills. The first bill that I introduced, the bill that led to the $100 million of hardest hit funds coming to clean up blight and abandonment, I co-sponsored with Congressman Mike Turner, a Republican from Dayton, Ohio. I've co-sponsored legislation to help families save for college with the Republican Congressman Tim Walberg from Michigan. So there's a lot more bipartisanship out there, even in Congress, as divided as it seems. But the problem is with the leadership. And until we get Republican leadership, and this is a problem that both parties bear some responsibility for, but until we're willing to overcome the short-term political gains that are derived from keeping one of these really sensitive issues in the forefront for political purposes and put America first, put the interests of the American people first, it's going to be very tough to get anything done. Unfortunately, Speaker Boehner applies something that those of us who follow politics call the Hastert rule. It's a rule that's named after a former speaker that basically says that if a majority of Republicans don't support a piece of legislation, even if with the Democrats, a small number of Republicans and a large number of Democrats could support a bill, it won't go to the floor of the House. And I just think that's unconscionable. It's not the way the framers of the Constitution imagined it working, and it's one of the reasons that the American people are so frustrated.
Now, talking about education next here, what do you think needs to be done? Education is something, we've got some school districts in our community that are doing very, very well, but we also have some that are really struggling. I mean, Flint and Saginaw, we lost Buena Vista, and that's causing some issues for Saginaw community schools now. What do you think needs to be done to ensure that our kids in Michigan and really in the country are getting a good education?
Well, first of all, every kid, no matter where they're born, no matter what zip code they're in, they should have an equal shot at the American dream. They should have a fair chance that says that if they work hard, if they study, they'll have the same opportunity that a child in the next school district will have. Unfortunately, in Michigan, that's not true. Because we have a system of school finance, it's a state system that rewards students who live in more affluent districts and leaves students in older communities like my hometown of Flint in obsolete buildings with textbooks that are 15 years old and completely irrelevant to what the world of work would require of them. That's not right. The federal government can play a role by providing compensatory programs for Title I reading programs, for example, or special education. I would have wished and would have hoped that when Congress had its stimulus bill to try to get the economy moving again, that it would have spent money on rebuilding obsolete schools. It didn't do that. The state government really needs to step up. The federal government can provide incentives for states to do so, but in this case, the state government really needs to step up and ensure that every child, no matter where they live, gets the access to the same high quality education with the same technology, the same new textbooks, the same high quality buildings, teachers who are respected and not derided for choosing that profession. I think unfortunately Governor Snyder and others have used teachers as a scapegoat. And the truth of the matter is it's an honorable profession and one that ought to be supported. Every kid ought to have access to a school that meets all those high standards.
Now, as far as job creation and developing business, we touched on it a little bit earlier with manufacturing, but what do you think needs to be done to really create jobs in this area?
Well, it starts with starting with trade policy, for example, to make sure that American products don't have unfair competition with foreign products being brought in to our nation, and then we're not able to sell products across the globe. So we start from a global perspective in making sure that we have trade policy that supports American manufacturing. And then then manufacturing policy. We have introduced a package of bills called the Make It in America plan. And it's a whole set of legislation that would support American manufacturing. For example, it would expand what the President has initiated, the development of manufacturing innovation institutes that create a connection between university research, private sector research, the public interest through its governments in developing technology, new technology that could be applied in manufacturing that makes our manufacturers more competitive. Ultimately, though, it's the skills of our workers that is the most important variable in growing our economy. If we invest in the people of the United States, the people of Michigan, the people of our communities, the jobs will go where the trained workforce is. We've seen this happen across the globe. If we have the best trained workers, we know they're willing to work, we know that people in Michigan work hard, but they need to have access to the training that employers need in the 21st century. Not just a college education, although that's important, but it's also those technical skills, those apprenticeship programs. I wrote legislation that would strengthen the bond between our community colleges. For example, Mott Community College and Delta College both have programs that offer training to manufacturers who are looking for specific skills, and allows for the increased taxes that that employee pays as a result of finding a job to cover the cost of their training. Basically pays back to that community college the cost of training those workers. That's the kind of programs that we should support, and that's one of the bills that I've introduced into the Congress. That would go a long way in strengthening our manufacturing base, and that would grow the economy and put people back to work.
Do you think that's one area where we are kind of not quite filling that void in Michigan right now? I mean, even Governor Snyder has even come out and said that we've got this job skills gap. There's a lot of people that have come out and said that. Do you think that's really an issue that needs to be addressed? It sounds like you're trying to address it with that. But do you think that's something we really need to be focusing more on?
We absolutely do. I mean, it takes more than just saying that we're for it, and that's where I take some issue with the governor. You can't say you're for closing the skills gap, but cut direct support to K-12 classrooms. You can't say you're in favor of advanced education, but cut state support to colleges and universities, which means that the cost of a college education, whether it's community college or a four-year university, goes up to the point where the typical worker, the typical individual can't afford it. So it's more than just recognizing that we have this skills gap. We have to be willing to invest in our people, and that means making a direct investment in colleges and universities and skill training, in the kind of workforce development that employers really need, knowing that when we do that, our economy will grow. And we, meaning our state government, our federal government, our families, we will be paid back for that investment. So we have to put our money where our mouth is. And so far, I haven't seen that be the case in state government.
I mean, speaking of business development, one thing a lot of Republicans, especially during this election period, have been talking about the tax policy and the corporate tax, and a lot of complaints on how high our corporate tax is. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think that's something that should be lowered, or is it? Do you like where it is now? What do you think should be done, or maybe should not be done?
Well, I support comprehensive tax reform that would, and this is oversimplification, which would lower the tax rates but broaden the base. The problem with the tax code is that for one employer, maybe the tax burden is such that they can't grow their business. But for many other employers, the tax code is such that they're not paying their fair share. The problem with the tax code is that it's complicated and it's unevenly applied. So for many of these large corporations, they avoid paying taxes by moving their corporate headquarters offshore, or by even just moving the ownership of the intellectual property of that company to an offshore entity that they've created, just to avoid federal taxes. That's not right, and we need to deal with that. So clearly we need to reform our tax code, but it has to start with the notion that everybody should pay a fair share. It should be transparent. But we can't have companies, local companies for example, small businesses that are trying to stay current and trying to reach new markets, paying a tax rate that is far lower than these large multinational companies are paying, because they're able to avoid taxes through trickery, moving their assets offshore. We can deal with that in Congress. We can deal with that in the tax code. That's the kind of reform that I think would make sense and that the American people would support.
I've talked about a lot of issues. What is the main issue for you, if reelected, to get done in your first 100 days in office?
Well, it's to get a jobs plan through Congress, to reinvest in infrastructure. We should do that right away. To pass comprehensive immigration reform, we should do that right away because it would be good for our economy. To reinvest in Pell Grants so that the cost of a college education is not so great that many people can't even think about college as an opportunity for them. Investing in our people, investing in our land, betting on our future, investing in manufacturing, knowing that if we make those investments now, we will grow our economy and we'll get to a balanced budget. We'll pay off the cost of that investment in no time. To me, it's all about jobs. And if we're not willing to do what it takes to create jobs in Congress, then we're not serving the needs of the American people.